had our cucumber and squash plants covered with a floating row cover for the early season insect control. But once the plants begin to flower, like we're starting to see here with some of our zucchini, that means it's time to remove the row cover. And the reason for this is that cucumbers and squash and melons are insect pollinated, mainly by bees. And if we have the row cover on, then those insects can't access the flowers to pollinate them, and we get no fruit. Now, of course, once we remove that row cover, our plants are suddenly susceptible to insect damage. And some of the main insects of concern with our zucchini and our cucumbers are the squash bug and also the cucumber beetle. So we're going to look at a few different ways we can manage those now that we've taken off our protective barrier. Now, we did start with our first line of defense, which was selecting resistant cultivars. Different plants are more or less susceptible to damage by these insects. Some are preferred more than others, and that mainly has to do with the level of cucurbitacin, which is a chemical produced by the plant. So we can select plants that are more tolerant, less susceptible to damage. Now, for squash bug control, we want to implement a number of different strategies to try to manage those. So they're a very difficult to control pest. One of the things we can do is lay boards in the garden, and this provides a place where the insects go to spend the night. During the day, they're out foraging on the plants, laying eggs, and at night they like to seek shelter under a dark space. And you can see here I have no mulch, I have bare soil because I want to limit the sheltering sites in my garden. And then I have boards laid down, and at night they'll go under the boards, and in the morning, if you come out early in the morning and flip those over, you'll find all sorts of squash bugs, and you can squish them on the board or knock them into soapy water to kill them. And that's a good way to reduce the population. We also want to regularly inspect our plants looking for egg masses, and they tend to lay their eggs on the undersides of the leaves or along the stem. And what you're looking for are clusters of about 15 or up to 40 bronze-colored eggs. And we're a little bit early in this season, but it's a good idea as soon as that weather warms up to start checking at least a couple of times a week, if not every other day. And when you find the egg masses, just squish them onto the plant to kill them. For our vining types of cucumbers and squash and melons, we can also trellis those to get them off the ground. My mother always used tomato cages around her cucumbers and squash to support them, and then as they grow, you could just train them into the cage. You want to put them in when the plants are young and then train them up, because it's very difficult to come back later once they're already long and try to train those in. Now, that protects against squash bugs, but cucumber beetles, we need a few different strategies. One of the things we can do is create a protective barrier on our plants by treating them with kaolin. And we did this with our tomato plants. It creates this nice film over the foliage, and it just interrupts the behavior of the cucumber beetle and discourages them from feeding and laying eggs. Another thing we can do is use yellow sticky cards as traps. Now, a lot of times we see these used for monitoring purposes on a large farm. When you have a really small planting like this, you can actually trap a fair number of beetles out by just using the sticky cards. And then if you combine that with a lure that contains that pheromone or caromone, cucurbitacin, that attracts even more beetles to our sticky trap. Another great method is called trap cropping, and we're going to practice that here. Trap cropping takes advantage of those plants that are more susceptible to the pest to draw them away from our main crop. So in this case, I'm using a squash. It's actually a zucchini called coquezel, and coquezel is highly susceptible to cucumber beetle. And I'm planting it at the end of the rows of my main squash crop, and my hope is that the cucumber beetles are going to be more attracted to these plants, and I have them on both ends, and then that'll concentrate the beetles in an area where I can treat them. And at that point I could treat them through vacuuming or through a chemical. Now, when we do treat with a pesticide, there's a few different options for both squash bugs and cucumber beetles. We can use insecticidal soaps and oils, such as neem. And when we do that, we want to make sure that we get really good coverage of our plants, and particularly pay attention to the undersides of the leaves and the stems, and then also right here in the center of the plant, this nice tender tissue. Oh, the insects just love that. So we want to make sure that we're getting really good coverage of the plants. We can also use a soil drench of neem, and that you mix into your watering can and you just apply around the soil. And then this acts as a systemic when we apply it in a soil drench. And what that means is that the plant actually takes up the chemical into its tissues, and when the insect tries to feed on the plant, that's when it gets into the insect. Chemical applications are only effective against the very young nymphal stages of the squash bug. Now with our cucumbers and our squash, we actually practice a real clean field sanitation. In our low-till system, a lot of times I encourage people to leave the cut plant material on the surface, but I don't do that with our squash and our cucumbers because there's often still egg masses and adult squash bugs and beetles in that material. So we want to take it out and put it into a hot compost, get it out of our gardens. Crop rotation can also help to some effect for those overwintering insects, but a lot of them, they're very mobile, so they can come in and move around the garden. And then finally, as with any plant system, healthy plants are going to be more resilient against pests. So we want to make sure that we practice good irrigation and fertilization.